and welcome back to the Challenger Startup. Today, I'm talking to Jennifer Levanduski about marketing and selling EdTech products to school districts. Jennifer has spent more than a decade leading marketing and growth operations for EdTech businesses. She's worked directly inside the realities of selling to districts, and she's familiar with their sales cycles, stakeholders, procurement processes, and increasingly tight budgets. I wanted to talk with Jennifer on why selling to school districts feels so difficult for EdTech startups, what most companies misunderstand about how districts actually make decisions, and how you can be one of the ones to survive procurement. It's going to be a great conversation. I hope you enjoy it. I know you have a ton of experience working in EdTech, but you've also worked in a lot of other tech industries. Can you tell us, in your experience, is there anything that makes being an EdTech marketer uniquely, let's say, painful compared to other spaces in tech?
Yeah, I think EdTech is an interesting space because in any given year, you are looking at things like a much longer sales cycle than your typical SaaS product. You're much more adhered to regular calendar budget years than a typical SaaS sales cycle. And you're also dealing with more kind of regulatory compliance issues. I know a lot of products, people are concerned about data and privacy and security, but in EdTech, there's FERPA, COPA, there's so many regulations you have to get through. And those, I would say, in any normal year, we don't live in a normal world anymore, those would be the differences. Right now, I think those are compounded by the fact that there is so much uncertainty happening in EdTech. EdWeek did a really great study where they asked a bunch of district leaders, like, what's the number one thing that you're anxious about? And they were like, I don't know, am I going to receive the federal funding I was told I was going to receive? There's so much budget uncertainty. There's so much kind of political uncertainty in terms of what's happening in school boards and what district administrators are being asked to do. Everyone's just kind of like so anxious because of all of the noise that's going on around the core work of educating, that makes decision-making and purchasing even harder than it normally is. The other thing I would say about what's going on in EdTech right now is it's kind of this interesting story where during the pandemic, you had district leaders and teachers and anyone who had a voice in what was happening in schools, just throw tech at the problem, right? They were like, man, we've got to convert to distance learning. We've got to do all this stuff. I don't know what's going on. We're going to just adopt a bunch of stuff and hope that it shakes out. So again, it was another EdWeek report that kind of talked about like the average district IT administrator was monitoring like 70 platforms. Obviously, that wasn't sustainable. When 22, 23 were in this pareback period where they were trying to rationalize the SKUs of products that they had kind of adopted in panic. And then AI happened. Kind of these two big adoption booms going kind of one right after the other with no time to pivot. And so people are feeling just super overwhelmed. And that's adding to that kind of anxiousness and uncertainty. So I would say, normal times, longer sales cycles, weirder budget cycles, lots of regulatory compliance. Right now, all of that plus everything is just so messy.
So a lot of politics around decision-making, a lot of difficulty around compliance, especially when you're targeting district buyers, on top of all the latest AI technology that's coming into the industry and having to deal with that. So that all kind of adds to difficult sales cycles and difficulty kind of breaking through the noise right now.
Yeah, absolutely. And even more so if you look at, I monitor like teacher TikTok and teacher Reddit because I just kind of like to know what's going on in classrooms. There are kind of more behavioral problems, more parent issues, more of that kind of external noise. I feel like right now there's just so much noise beyond what schools intend to do, what schools and districts intend to do, which is like, let's get learning outcomes for students. Right now, you're in this place where there's everything around it is trying to take focus from that. And I think that makes selling into those entities really difficult right now because everyone's just so distracted and there's so much uncertainty in the air.
So I talked to a lot of EdTech marketers and a lot of people who are selling to districts, and lots of people have strong opinions about how to sell to schools and how not to. So from your experience, is there anything that you would say marketers consistently get wrong or could be doing better when it comes to selling to school districts?
Yeah, consistently I think is a strong word, but I do think that there are some weaknesses within the industry. One thing that I will say, right, and like I live in San Francisco, I live in the Bay Area, I am about as lost in the sauce as you can get from like a tech perspective. I think a lot of tech companies get so excited about the tech and about being in that space and that sort of thing that they don't adjust their value language to speak to the audience that they're trying to reach. They sound like tech people. They don't sound like people who are interested in education. I think a lot of the messaging falls flat when you fail to look at it from the other perspective where you kind of can't get out of your own world. Another thing that I I think we've seen kind of all across the board, but certainly more recently, is this notion that you often have decision makers at a school leadership, but more often district leadership level, who are making decisions about products and tech and learning tools that are coming into districts, but they aren't the people who are implementing it, and they aren't the people who are ultimately going to get the results from using it. And so if you don't have a fully baked, here's our pre-sale, here's our sale, here's our implementation, here's our training, here's our check-in, here's our full life cycle to make sure that you're proving out that value. If you don't have that set from like day 5 of the conversation, you've kind of already lost whether they choose to adopt you or not. So, right now tech companies the onus on them is so much more to bear the, are you providing results for my students? So if you skip that post-sale piece of it and make it part of kind of the full customer journey for the district to make sure that your end users are being trained and that sort of thing, that I think people don't do that as well as they should, especially early stage companies. They're so excited to talk to you and get you to adopt. And then it's like, well, I don't know, here's a couple of videos and hopefully it works out and we'll talk to you at the midpoint of the year. And that's just not how districts are purchasing right now. And so those are the two that I would say consistently. We miss the mark on messaging because we want to talk like tech people. And then 2, we don't consider that like training implementation part, which is so important to make sure that the product is sticky and gets used.
That's interesting. The first thing that you said is more like a top of funnel problem. A lot of people come from B2B and they're trying to break into EdTech and they just don't know how to talk to the user. They don't know their audience because it's just such a different world. The values are different. These are folks who are very mission driven, and some of the B2B tech people don't really fully understand how to speak to that. And if you can't do that, if you can't understand what their goals are and what they want to achieve, it's difficult to break through the noise and just get interest and attention.
EdTech is, kind of B2B sales, but it's B2B with heart. It's kind of like almost it's right. And so I think if you're making those transitions, it's capitalism, it's sales, it's you're moving your product, but it's not just for a bottom line. It's for a bottom line that's learning outcomes, which is associated with a mission that is so deeply felt by everyone in that purchasing and decision experience. So if you approach it like traditional tech or traditional kind of like B2B stuff, you're going to miss the mark because you're missing that emotion piece of it.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. And then there's just this notion that like we expect people sometimes as marketers, particularly as people who are deep in tech, we expect people to be where we are as opposed to trying to meet them where they are. One of my favorite examples of this, I was at one of the earliest like ASU GSV air shows, the kind of AI thing. I'm sitting in a session, at a table full of educators because again, I'm nosy. I like to hear what people react to things. And, I don't even remember who the pitch was, but it was this, and oh my goodness, and this is going to change your life. And here's the autogrid and here's all the stuff. And the second grade teacher who was sitting next to me, she was like, wow, this all seems super interesting. And, and it's from what I could tell, she was, San Diego educator, super, well-liked, had like a teacher of the year badge. I don't know. She seemed great. She was a lovely lady. And she's like, well, you seem like a techie person. Like what I really want to do is have my kids make a word cloud for Mother's Day. Like, will that do this? And so like the gap between what she was being talked at about versus like the real tech stuff that would make a difference in her classroom were so, and that's kind of an extreme case, but I think about that every time I read a piece of copy and think, would my nice friend from San Diego understand this? A lot of times it's no.
That makes good sense. We have to understand who we're talking to. Second part of what you said is kind of more of on the very bottom of the funnel where, you have to actually make sure these people are using the product and that they're trained properly. And that kind of goes back to what you said. It actually has to do what they need it to. It has to be useful enough for them to actually integrate it and use it every day in the classroom in order to have those people stick and to retain them and not churn, right?
Yeah. I mean, again, I think it's like if you're selling MarTech, you're talking to the demand gen team, they're going to ostensibly make the decision and then someone's going to sign off on the budget and then they're going to be the ones that use it. So the users are so much closer to the purchase process. In EdTech, you've got decision makers who haven't been in a classroom in years and they're not the people who are going to be using it. And so missing that training, implementation, follow-up, how are things going, making sure that it is being used. If you don't have that set up front, you're not going to be sticky and you're just going to churn out.
To that point, the teachers or whoever the end users are obviously really important. But I've heard a lot of disagreement about the model to use when it comes to sales. So selling directly to the districts versus the teacher up model. First selling to the teachers and then having either the teachers advocate and sell it to the districts for you, or doing some kind of tracking of how many teachers in a district are using the product and then using that as a foot in the door, so to speak.
Yeah, I don't want to burst everyone's collective bubble here, but, kind of 90% of marketers that I have ever worked with in EdTech have had the great idea of, well, if we can just cultivate a few teacher advocates, and then when you get 4 of them, you take it to the district office and they're going to be the ones that this is how it's going to work. And I've never seen it work. I think the instances, you hear stories like Canva, or you hear stories like even just like early Google Drive, like you hear those kinds of stories where it was a kind of teacher up movement. And I think that works for a consumer product that then has an education arm to it. People are already using it. And then they were just like, oh, shoot, ed is another market segment. Okay, great. We'll let that kind of fester into its thing. And then eventually we'll launch in that way. But for purpose-built EdTech products, I haven't ever seen it be successful. And I have a couple hypotheses about why that is. One, we talked briefly before, teachers they're having a rough time right now in terms of what's going on in classrooms. And so like new tech and new tools are not necessarily on the top of their mind. For some teachers, even the most like super techie ones, they're going to want to find new things. But then bringing that in is challenging, right? If it's an app, they can't put it on Chromebooks. They have to have IT. And if you have IT involved, then you have all this other stuff that goes on. 2, is that really worth the effort? That sort of thing. And I think that And so like even just bringing new things in that you want to try, if you want it to be used at a student level, there's just so many logistics that are challenging there. And then even, okay, so, you're at a charter school and you can do whatever you want and you've done all this, amazing. Now a company is saying, hey, super overextended teacher, now we're asking you to go do advocacy on our behalf. That's bonkers. It just like as a motion, it just doesn't make any sense. And I know that everyone says, well, we're just going to seed the things. And then as soon as you get a swell, then we can use that. And like, I've never seen it work that way. I've seen much more success in top-down selling. And I'm super excited for someone in your comments to tell me that I'm wrong.
Yeah, that's really interesting because there are folks who are absolutely married to the teacher up model, and especially at the early stages before they've actually gone to market. There's this idea that that's the way to go, but it definitely makes sense that teachers are already overextended. They don't wake up. They don't go to sleep saying, I need a new platform, and certainly not, I'm going to go advocate for this platform. I'm going to spend my time moving this up the ladder. So that certainly makes sense. And why would they? There better be some kind of really good incentive if you're going to even try.
Yeah. I think that there is so much room for teacher voice and teacher perspective in the EdTech space, right? If you're super, super early, the best thing you can do is find 10 teachers from people and Teacher Reddit to say, hey, can I pay you to spend an hour with me and give me your feedback and tell me what you think? And if you like it, I can use the quote, right? Like there's so much value in all of that, but to expect that to turn into your big picture district selling strategy, I just haven't seen it be successful. Teachers just don't have the budget approval. They don't have the political capital to move things up the chain in that way. And they just don't have the time or energy to be advocating for things in the way that you would expect. Like again, I'll go back to my MarTech example, right? Like if you've got a junior marketing ops manager who's a real go-getter and they find a new tool, they're going to bring that up and they've kind of got the juice to make that move. From a teacher perspective, they're so many levels away from the buying power that I just don't think it's a reasonable ask.
And I totally agree with you. There's so much to be done as far as doing case studies, customer stories, and really going deep in terms of getting good insights and research, and also for getting teachers to advocate for you and talk about your product for your promotional materials. But that's kind of a far cry from actually asking them to sell for you. That's a little different, right? You want teachers to love the product and talk about it, but the district admins should assess that for themselves. They should be able to see that from your promotions, from your marketing materials, and make that decision on their own. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, absolutely. Again, I think there's so much room for teacher voice, but I don't expect teachers to be your kind of like contract reps.
So for folks who are kind of unfamiliar with the district decision-making process, can you walk us through what that purchase journey actually looks like and not kind of this idealized version that a lot of EdTech folks imagine?
Yeah, I think most district sales motions are a lot like enterprise ABM, except that the org charts are different, the titles are different. There's a lot more differentiation in titles and what those titles mean and who has those responsibilities. And then I find in EdTech, there's more kind of like goal line blockers than you get in your traditional SaaS sales, because even if you've done all your due diligence to say, okay, who's everyone I need to have at the table, someone's going to come in over the top and be like, well, actually, this budget just got allocated over here, or actually our Chromebook compliance just added this thing. And so now you need 4 more lines of code to make that happen. Like, there's more blockers, but every district is its own kind of universe, and the way in which they make decisions is different. As a good rule of thumb, I would say, you're often dealing with like a director of IT or technology, a director of curriculum or instruction. Some districts have a title called director of innovation, which particularly if you're in the EdTech space or like is a good person to talk to, they'll usually have a seat at most tables, or director of outcomes, something like that, depending on what your product is. Those are going to be kind of the core 4 or 5 titles that most EdTech companies work with. And then and oftentimes it's never just one person. And then some districts have buying committees where they bring in school leaders, or maybe they bring in some teachers, but like at the end of the day, one person still makes the decision. So you're still going through that kind of like really good ABM process of, okay, who's my decision maker? Who are my influencers? Who else is at the table? And how do I have really compelling value stories and touch point plans for all of them? There's a lot of overlap between the way that you do enterprise ABM and the way that you sell to districts. It's just that if you want to sell a MarTech solution, eventually your CMO or a head of marketing or a director of marketing is going to sign off on it because they own the budget. That those titles stay the same across most SaaS companies. In districts, I think there's just so much more variability in titles. So you have to really dig in and do your homework about who the people are, what they call themselves, what things they're responsible for, and then kind of what pet projects they have in mind to make sure that you're selling the value story in the right way. The other thing to keep in mind is just that the purchasing window is super different than most other industries, right? Like from an annual calendar perspective, most EdTech companies, you do your brand building in the fall, then everyone comes back from winter break, and midpoint of January is when you start doing your real heavy, okay, this is where I'm going to set my pipeline for the year. You're doing heavy sales January through March. Districts get their budgets in May, June. So if you don't have kind of intent to purchase by April, you're not going to hit your year. And then, your POs come in June, July, you're implementing in July, August, and then you're off to the races again. And so one of the things I think that's interesting about EdTech vis-a-vis some other industries is, by February 15th, if you're going to make your year, because if you don't have enough in pipeline by then, it's almost insurmountable to overcome it, which is very different than most other SaaS companies. So from an individual selling perspective, it's not that different, just a lot more nuance. But from an overall like annual planning calendar, there's kind of like 2 failure points. And if you don't hit them, you got to have to go back to the drawing board from a planning perspective.
So obviously seasonality, much more important than other types of SaaS companies. You mentioned there certainly is a buying committee, which is important, but there's usually one person who has the kill switch, so to speak, when it comes to that decision. And yeah, you mentioned a few titles, potential decision makers are part of the committee, right? And I know a lot of folks are targeting superintendents. Almost across the board, superintendents are part of the intended audience. But do you think that folks tend to like over-index on superintendents, or is that appropriate?
Yeah, that is a whole group of people that also probably make decisions depending on kind of what the product is and how big the initiative is. I think superintendents, assistant superintendents are valuable allies, but at the end of the day, unless you've got a very small district, they're going to, if they see something interesting that comes across their desk, they're going to push that down because they just don't have they're not in the day-to-day of what are we bringing in to make, they're going to put it to their instruction person, they're going to put it to their outcomes person for true evaluation. So they're a powerful ally, I would say. And in some instances, depending on the size of district, and like I said, everyone's different, they have a seat at the table, but I haven't necessarily found them to be the biggest growth driver. I did a superintendent's event a couple of years ago, and I was kind of baffled by this notion. We're having this like roundtable discussion about student outcomes, and someone was just like, yeah, I would be super excited to spend my time thinking about student outcomes, but they just elected a Mom for America to our school board, so the only thing I do is spend my time arguing with this lady that like the books in the library aren't corrupting children. That's how I spend 60% of my time now, right? Because there's so much external, again, this kind of concept of this external noise that's going on, and superintendents as sometimes having been appointed or elected or, even if or hired, or, they're working with the school board who's in most instances is elected, like they have constituents beyond just what they are managing in the actual district itself. My take is that superintendents spend a lot of time managing that. So what goes on in the actual district vis-a-vis learning is, again, great ally. And if you have a good relationship with the superintendent, you meet someone or someone's interested in the product, they're definitely a great ally to have at the table. I don't see them making final decisions on learning materials most of the time. Again, I'd be interested to hear some other perspectives.
Certainly. So in more cases, more of like a gatekeeper, or someone who, pushes it up the ladder. Most of the companies I work partially targeting superintendents and then special education directors, student service directors, that kind of thing, to be more, specific to their product, which tends to be verticalized.
Yeah. I don't know. I think it's almost like gate accelerator, right? Like, because if your boss says, "Hey, I saw this cool thing, take a look at it," it's going to move to the top of your pile. And so, as I said, like a good ally, a good door opener, but probably not ultimately a decision maker. But they are going to sign off on the budget, so they're good to have in your corner.
Going back to, getting the attention of the people who need to get buy-in for the product, we like to say that there needs to be a belief shift in order to get even initial buy-in for that product enough to start a conversation. In your opinion, at what point do you think district decision makers mentally decide, yes, to a vendor, this is worth pursuing or even considering?
Yeah, I think you get to a yes when your fear of not adopting becomes greater than your fear of, I'm going to screw up if I do adopt this, right? I think especially in times of emotional anxiety and uncertainty, everyone is just scared that they're going to make the decision that brings the wrath of the Mom for America on the school board, or they're going to make the decision that tanks the math scores, or they're going to make the decision that increases the angry parent emails. And so, especially when you're bringing new solutions or new things, you're not battling against battling is a rough word, competing with other solutions. You're competing with, am I going to be considered a screw up if I try something new and it doesn't work? And so the way that you get to the yes is by making the fear of the opportunity cost of not adopting, the opportunity cost of not trying the new thing, the opportunity cost of not embracing whatever the solution is. That's got to be larger than the fear of, am I going to screw this up, or is this going to be considered a mistake? And that's where you get your yes, or at least that's what I've seen.
A couple of things you said that were interesting. Number one is you're not always competing against your competitors, so to speak. You're competing against whatever the biggest alternative is to what you're doing, right? So that's kind of what you need to speak to. And the second thing you said is that it's almost more important to show them the cost of not using this product or not doing things this way. The way that we like to approach that is with, content intellectual property is what we call it. So the enemy in the industry or the enemy of their department as this kind of broader concept, making your content around the problem with not doing things the way that your solution approaches it. So we're in what a lot of people are calling the great ignore. And with all the AI content, everything kind of seeming the same, it's getting harder and harder to break through it. How do you get around that? How do you break through that noise in 2026 when it's so hard to do?
Yeah. Apparently EdWeek is getting a lot of free shoutouts. Another one of the things that I read on there, someone had hypothesized, like, there are X number of EdTech companies. Every single one of them is going after the same 6 titles in district offices. The average district decision maker is receiving, it was upwards of 5,000 cold marketing messages over the course of a semester or something like that. Obviously, you're going to tune that out, right? I love the phrase, the great ignore, because even just societally, we're so overwhelmed by marketing all the time that it becomes kind of like a protect your peace to be like, nope, no more. We can't do it. Right. Not like in the good old days when you saw a billboard once a day, right? Like the thousands and thousands of messages you're getting, personal, professional, all that, it's really easy to filter out. I would say the things that are breaking through the noise are outcomes and social proof. So there's been kind of a shift over the last 8-10 years, right, where districts look at vendors as like, hey, I don't want you to sell me something, I want you to be a partner. And that language has existed for a while, but I think it's more apt now than it ever has been, because of all of this noise and pressure and kind of underperformance and post-pandemic stuff in the schools and all that kind of stuff. Everyone should be focused on, what are my student outcomes and how How are we improving them? And anything I bring into the district has to immediately improve student outcomes, or maybe not, but has to improve student outcomes. So the number one thing that you can do to break through that noise is say, hey, we work with 5 districts just like yours, and here's how we improve student outcomes for them. That's attractive because you're making yourself a safe choice and you're making yourself a proven choice because, and when I say that the kind of the focus is on that more than ever, districts are getting smarter in how they buy, right? Districts are pushing back to say, hey, we're super excited to try this, but can we move to outcomes-based pricing? So if you don't deliver the results that you say you are, then we're not on the hook as much. Or, hey, they're really kind of digging in with vendors in this way to be more deeply enmeshed and be on the hook for delivering those results. So proof of value in improving those outcomes is definitely the number one way you can get through. The second is with social proof. Big proponent of UGC, big proponent of peer stories. This is where your case studies and I was so excited and your qualitative. We surveyed 100 of our users and 99% of them said they couldn't live without us. Like all of those kind of statistics are going to be appealing, ideally as a backup to your I have actual efficacious proof of that my product works. But then if you pair that with the social proof, those are the two things that I see making their way through the kind of wall of nope, no more marketing.
Completely agree with that. I think social proof is certainly king when it comes to content and breaking through the noise because you can't replicate it. You can't replicate what one business has done for a district or what they've achieved for a certain school or for a certain child. You can't replicate that story like you can just curate content on a topic and talk about conceptually. It's actually your results and your real stories from your real humans and combining that with that content intellectual property. So something that is your personal perspective as a brand, something that you've coined, and then putting that through your real results. That can't be replicated, never can. What can't be duplicated by AI, kind of what breaks through the noise right now.
Yeah, I totally agree.
As far as we talked a little bit about the content, which I think is relevant across any channel you're using, but what channels are still working in your opinion these days when it comes to reaching district decision makers?
Yeah, I mean, the thing that's interesting in Ed is that a lot of the legacy channels still work from a relationship-based perspective, right? Like if you're just starting out, I think one of the best things you can do is go talk to someone who's been in the field for 20 years in a territory that you're interested in and say, hey, can you introduce me to 10 great districts that you think might be interested in this? Without, making sure that there's no conflict of interest, whatever, because it is still a very relationship driven space and your field reps really are great door openers. In Ed, I do still think that the big trade shows and conferences are a big deal. ISTE, FETSI, TCEA, those kind of things, depending on what sort of product you have, the discipline specific shows, your NSTAs or your NCTMs, that sort of thing. If that seems a little too grandiose, I'm a huge proponent of the state level or regional shows. So like, if you can't get to NSTA, go to the PSTA, the Pennsylvania Science Teachers Association, Hershey, Pennsylvania in December. It's always lovely, but like you get a really captive audience of 400 or 500 people who have nothing better to do than sip a hot chocolate and talk about your product. And so particularly if you're trying to get early feedback or you're trying to make early strides in a territory, I love those. And so like, again, not necessarily what you're talking about, but advice that I would give to folks in EdTech is like those face-to-face interactions, those personal connections, they still make a huge difference in this space. I would say more so than some others. Inbound, still super important. Your organic inbound is still going to be your best, which means that you have to make sure that your site is optimized and you're showing up and you have a good understanding of what people are looking for. Obviously and you obviously know way more about this than I do, but the arena on that is changing so much and so rapidly that making sure that you have a good handle on, what worked in SEO even 8 weeks ago probably isn't working right now. And so how do you make sure that you're kind of at the forefront of those changes, but making sure that you're getting good traffic to your website, it makes sense. From a paid perspective, if you have a really compelling content asset, that's what I've seen work. Have a great white paper or a great case study, or you have some of those like value story content pieces we were talking about, promoting those to specific audiences, those still do fairly good lead generation from what I've seen. Cold outbound email, that's a fool's errand right now. I don't know. I've seen LinkedIn InMail be successful for very specific offers. Join a webinar. Hey, we have this great researcher who's speaking, that sort of thing. That still seems to get some results for district titles. And then the other thing that I would say is like from an outbound perspective, I think cold outbound is really hard right now. What I have seen work is, if you've got a really strong ABM plan, some gifting component, especially if it's something that, either their colleagues or students in the district can use. If you have like some, make sure you're following the rules about dollar amount and all that kind of stuff. But like a package arriving will still get some sort of result. And then my hot take, I don't know, we'll see. I've borne this out a couple times. I think direct mail is kind of on a comeback. People are so inundated with electronic advertising that I think like a well-placed, I did a postcard campaign late last year that had pretty good results. I think there's something there. So I think your traditional inbound methods are still important. Just make sure that you're very closely watching your funnel and what's producing for you, because I do think the rules keep changing pretty quickly. The tried and true industry methods, those face-to-face connections are still super important in this space. And then I would say like on your outbound, get creative, because cold email isn't going to do it for you.
Yeah, interesting. Love that take. I think, certainly for most EdTech businesses, especially at the early stages, those events, those face-to-face opportunities, anytime you can get face-to-face in front of someone, that's the best. Of course, when you want to scale past a certain point, you're going to want to start looking to inbound. And that's going to require not being face-to-face, right? So someone has to make a decision without a salesperson being there right in front of them. And I think as far as outbound, as far as paid, and even SEO, if you're going to be generating demand, you have to be educating them about why they should pay attention to you, right? It's really, in most cases, an educational sell instead of a feature-based or a benefits or outcomes-based sell, shifting their belief by teaching them something and showing them what the alternative is and why is that better. As far as people who are doing traditional SEO, like in-market intent-based SEO, in order to get into AI search results, you need to be in roundups, right? So like you need to be ranking in those best of lists. And that's in like on your own site and off-site as well. Super important if you want to be ranking in LLMs on category search. And there was just some research done about how many more people are starting their search in LLMs. What I've seen so far, people tend to over-index on category-based searches. Like people aren't searching for the category yet, and demand generation is actually more important than they might think.
I think content's still super important. But it's got to be the right content. I think that, as you just alluded to, right? Like if you were in my fictional MarTech SaaS organization, you could crank out nice feature-based content, nice jobs to be done framework use cases, and pepper that in with a couple other things. And you could call that a content calendar and be done. I think in education right now, again, because of all of this stuff around it that we talked about, content has to establish credibility, provide value, and create that sense of missing out that we've been speaking about. And so content is super important. People are still consuming content. Educators, my goodness, right? Like they love to read. They love studies. They love research. They love all of those things. So content is still very important, but they have because they are, educators, they have a very high sniffometer about things. And so if you are trying to produce those, kind of like a SaaS blog content, they're going to sniff through it. It doesn't matter. So your content pieces have to be, like I said, establishing credibility. So whether that's you're doing primary research, or maybe you partner with a name in the space who's a researcher or an educator, and they have an interesting position, and they, you can kind of publish on their behalf, that sort of thing. Those always perform well. We improved outcomes in this way by doing this, those kinds of pieces, particularly if you can align those to the type of district that's consuming the content. Those are really great. And then those educator stories, those, kind of that UGC social proof that we were talking about, that's gone really well. One of the best content programs I ever did, I was at a company who was kind of in the digital curriculum space. We surveyed 1,500 educators, school leaders, district leaders about kind of their thoughts on curriculum, and published the State of Curriculum report, which was obviously a giant undertaking because, all the educators were incented to spend their time filling out the survey. It was a lot of data analysis. It was a lot of writing. But that content piece, which we did kind of every other year, had such a tremendous impact because it immediately established credibility for the organization as a provider in the digital curriculum space to say, well, hey, they must really know what they were talking about. They've now surveyed, 4,500 educators over the course of 6 years, and they know kind of what the attitudes are. That was seen as such a high value piece of content, and you could get 2 years worth of content calendar out of it. So that's what I'm saying. I think you've got to it's super important, but it's got to be the right stuff.
You mentioned that, of course, UGC and testimonials and teacher stories and school stories, very important stuff. But there's even a higher bar when it comes to talking to these district folks. They're used to reading studies. They're used to seeing legitimate, proven information. So the more actual proof you can have, the more authority you can have behind what you're saying, the better. Like, for example, I'm working with a tech product right now that they have great district results, but they also have an awesome halo behind that of this Stanford-backed research study that they did. And the only thing they needed help with is packaging the results of that study in a way that's compelling for districts to look at. There's this awesome peer-reviewed study, but they're not going to go download that and just read through it on their own. You have to package the results in a way that's interesting for them to take the next step and look at, and which can be done across channels like outbound, inbound, paid, everything, right?
Yeah, I'm a big proponent of like, make your content work for you. So if you have one central thesis, you do a survey, you should get 100 pieces out of that, right? Because you publish your whole report, and then you publish this lens and this lens and this lens and this lens, and then you look at just this question, and then you look at just that question, and then you compare last year's to this year's. Like, you should be able to get so much relevant, credibility producing content out of kind of one big piece. You know, if you do a webinar with a highly respected researcher, then you've got long form clip, you've got short clips, you've got the transcript, you've got the blog post that comes from the transcript, you've got the quote. Like, you should be making sure that those things work for you, because you never know or you don't know at the beginning what the entry point in is going to be. So you use it to create a lot of content, then you kind of watch where the hooks are to get people ultimately to, you know, kind of the big long form piece that you're trying to get them to.
Yeah, sort of the Gary Vee approach with you on that. That's kind of the strategy we've been taking. First thing we do is come up with this long form asset, which does everything, right? So it has the content IP, the enemy, it has the mechanism and the solution, it has the proof, and it has the call to action in it. But that big kind of mega piece can be broken out into hundreds of smaller content pieces that are mini versions of this longer sales letter.
Yep. Yeah, totally makes sense.
Yeah. So again, back to the concept of kind of pre-selling a district before the decision to move forward happens. What would you say content needs to accomplish in order to pre-sell a district?
Yeah, I mean, you have to establish credibility, and you have to start to create that sense of missing out by not taking the sales call or eventually not adopting. And so the content that pre-sells does those two things effectively. And I think all of the stuff that we just talked about fits into this, right? So your credibilities are going to credibility builders, or your, you know, particularly if you're new in the space, partnering with a researcher or a well-known educator or someone who spoke at ISTE and you're like, hey, I liked what they said, and now I'm going to get them to come work with us, right? Like, having some educator adjacent credibility, that helps. This kind of primary research that we just talked about helps, and this efficacy evidence, those are all things that are going to make you credible. And then how you build that like fear of, oh shoot, I'm going to miss out if I don't adopt this. Your similar district wins. I keep talking about this because I think it's super important. Your regional proof points, right? So if you can say of the 60 school districts in Iowa, 30 of them are already doing Y and you're not one of them, that like, all right, I'll take the call because I want to understand what's going on. So if you can pull in kind of hyper specific cohorts to make the district a part of, and, you know, state level is not a super specific one, but maybe it's, man, of the 75 districts in the country that have this number of students and this test score and have a winning football team, you're the only one that's not doing Y, right? Like, make them part of a group. And then be like, yeah, but you're the only one in the group that's not doing this thing. There's lots of ways to like slice and dice data now that you can kind of create some of the FOMO that way. So that's another one. And then roundups, infographic. I love an infographic, right? Like a nice one page. It's got 3 clear points on it, that sort of thing. And it helps to spur that emotion of, oh man, it like, is the mistake doing nothing? Because you know, as you said, you're not necessarily working against competitors. In many instances, you're working against both fear and inertia. And so anything you can do to overcome that by making it shiny, attractive, that kind of missing out pieces, is super important. So the content that pre-sells, it establishes you as credible, makes you an expert. You know, you pass the sniff test of, is anyone going to be upset if we do this? No, they're credible. They have research. They've partnered with people, and they have results. They know what they're doing. And then, is doing nothing a better option? No, my goodness, of course not. We want to be in those in crowds that are already using this thing or learning in this way or doing whatever it is. So those are the two that I think are super important.
That makes total sense to me. Understanding the pain of the alternative and then just making it super clear for them why they should take the next step and simplifying it down. I love that you mentioned infographics. Visualization is one of the best ways to simplify it down so like a 3-year-old can understand what your complex product is doing. To wrap things up, what's the biggest piece of advice? What's the 80-20 from your perspective on an EdTech company trying to go from, say, 1 million to 10 million plus? What's the number one thing that you would tell them to do or to stop doing?
Yeah, I mean, so you've got $1 million coming in every year. You've had some early wins, you've got some traction, you've got some users. The number one thing you need to go do is convert your early wins into vocal advocates. So make sure that every single user that you currently have has done a case study, has provided a quote, and that you're amplifying them. Oh my goodness, you've done such a great job with this. Do you want to speak in a webinar telling everyone how you've been so successful? Oh my goodness, would you like to speak at your state level conference talking about how great you've been in the classroom with this product? So you kind of make your early customers advocates as well as kind of make them your stars. So you're bolstering their profile, but then they're also giving you that credibility that you need. Referral loops are also great. They work-ish in EdTech, but if you want to put a referral incentive program in place, that's certainly a good thing to do. But I would say make sure that your early adopters are creating that flywheel of growth for you. The other thing that I would say is, you have to be really honest with yourself about where that revenue has come from, and then what's repeatable and what's scalable. Okay, so if your first $1 million in ARR came from the fact that you have a previous district administrator on staff and they brought in 6 of their buddies, eventually, that's probably it. That's all. You can squeeze that all out. Now you have to actually go build demand. But if your early demand came from events or conferences or inbound or outbound or whatever it was, you have to take a really good hard look at what you've created, what worked and what didn't, double down on what worked and step back from what didn't, even if that kind of hurts your feelings because you really like that channel. I'm a big Kill Your Darlings fan. And be really honest about how those channels are going to work at scale because everything runs out eventually. And then the other thing I would say is you are sitting on a gold mine of feedback. So going way back to one of the first things we talked about, that tech people are so lost in the sauce, you now have a captive audience to tell you, is your product meeting the needs, but also is your messaging meeting the needs? Use your early adopter group to provide feedback on both product functionalities and informing the roadmap and all that kind of stuff. And then there's really good things that you can do in terms of saying we were educator informed, or we partnered with people, or we partnered with our early cohort to make sure that it does this. Those are all good stories to tell and kind of give you some of that more educator credibility, but also use that group to test your messaging and how you're talking about yourselves, because they're going to be able to tell your story to their peers way better than you can. So make sure that you're using, kind of leveraging them in that way. From a 0 to 1, that's hard. 1 to 10, super easy. You've got a growth wheel already in place. Make sure you're leveraging your early adopters to amplify that message is kind of the number one thing I would say.
Yeah, I love that. Never lose focus on your customer, right? So as far as getting learnings, insights, and feedback, but also using them to promote your product and create your messaging and your content, full circle, informing the product, creating the messaging, everything. And then to your point, being ruthless with the budget, cutting what doesn't work. And maybe that just means good KPIs. It doesn't mean anything direct response, direct revenue, but being smart with your KPIs, really being realistic and cutting what doesn't work. So that wraps up all the questions for today. Jennifer, thank you again so much. And for founders and other folks who want to follow your work, can you tell us where they can follow you or connect with you?
Yeah, you can find me on LinkedIn, Jennifer Levanduski. There's only 1 or 2 of us. You'll find me. I assume maybe we can link that somewhere. I also am the co-founder of an agency that works with startups from pre-seed to Series C, getting you to the capital that you need, whether that's in raise or revenue. And you can find us online at therisingtidepartners.com. And then if you ever just, you thought this was great and you want to hear me pontificate more, please feel free to check us out at our Substack. It's called Swell and Scale. My co-founder and I write every week on go-to-market topics, and you can find that at QUYNTON.substack.com.
Awesome. Jennifer, thanks so much. This has been great.
Thanks so much. Always happy to chat go-to-market.